You're listening to The Big Lift, the podcast of WebTrends Optimize, the CRO solution that enables marketers and developers to maximize the ROI on their digital properties. WebTrends Optimize is a powerful, feature-rich and easy-to-use solution, all delivered within a fixed-price contract with no additional cost for increased functionality ever. During these podcasts, we meet some of the key influencers within the marketing and conversion world to understand their roles and examine their challenges. Like most of us in conversion rate optimization, we're often challenged to understand every aspect of customer engagement to maximize the potential conversion opportunities. So today, I'm talking with Edmund Beggs, a CRO consultant at Conversion.com, about their levers framework. This comprehensive system helps define and categorize the different features of user experience that influence user behavior. By following this framework, you'll be able to iterate more effectively, isolate the learnings from early tests, and use them to drive bigger wins further down the line. Ed, checking through your LinkedIn profile, I saw you did your degree in politics and philosophy and your master's in cognitive and decision sciences. Have either of these helped in your career thus far?
Yeah, I think so. One of the main reasons I actually started out in CRO in the first place was a real commonality, both in terms of the topic of investigation, so understanding how it is that people think and make decisions, but also some of the methods involved and the kinds of work that I've been doing at Conversion and CRO. But beyond that, I think as I've progressed through doing more work on frameworks, the levers framework, as we'll discuss, and looking at other ways that we can organise our thinking in order to learn iteratively over time with experiments. I think there's even been some influence from some of my interest in philosophy of science, some of the ways of, I guess, taking a step back from the things that you think you know about a particular topic and thinking about the ways that you can set yourself up to increase your understanding over time. So thinking about ways that you can reinterpret data, thinking about ways that you can develop theories iteratively without necessarily committing to the view that you definitely believe something exactly as you phrased it about a user. So really taking that slightly more abstracted view, I think, has helped when it comes to things like the levers framework and a broader, I guess, epistemology, if you like, for how you can think about learning about user behavior.
Yeah, because I've had a number of people who have studied psychology as part of their degree and their education, but not philosophy. So it seems a bit more abstract than perhaps the psychological approach. But it must be interesting to be able to, as you say, fall back on what you learnt, to be able to understand why people are making decisions in a certain way, as opposed to the psychology of it, what they're feeling and things like that might be quite different. Without going into too much detail, because one thing that I came across as I was digging into the course that you're doing, there was something about the axioms of probability, and I was wondering how that may influence decision making.
So is that in terms of how we think about how people think about probability, I suppose? I think it's probably to an extent less about mapping on one-to-one the assumption that precisely how probabilities work is how people are going to think about them. I think probably in that difference and discrepancy is where it can often be most important and interesting in the context of CRO. So, particularly when we're thinking about how we frame different things, we might look to use the fact that potentially people will overly discount things that seem intuitively less likely or potentially think things are much more likely than, strictly speaking, they ought to be. So I'd say to the extent that it's come into CRO as a way of thinking about users, it's that difference, though of course probabilities are a crucial part of how we work in statistics, so there's a method side as well there.
So absolutely, I can think it's very difficult to nail down how an individual is thinking, because you have to kind of group them into buckets and define their behaviour, bucket-like behaviour, if you like. So obviously the individual where they think differently, maybe at an edge case or something like that, because you've got to be able to follow the herd to a greater or lesser degree.
Yes, yeah. So it is always, I guess, a difficult part of the work that we're doing, that we are interpreting populations, but we are intuitively much better, I think, as people at thinking about the concrete reasons why individuals do things. Very easy to explain, easy to point to reasons like I believed X, I hoped for Y, and so I did whatever it is I did. But when you're thinking about population level dynamics, there's obviously a lot of variability going on there, a lot of people doing things for different reasons that they themselves might not understand. So it definitely adds an extra dimension of complexity to the way that we have to train ourselves to think.
So let's move on a bit and talk about levers, as in the word leverage, not as opposed to people leaving the company. We'll talk about your levers framework. Can you explain the overall construct? What is it?
So the idea of the levers framework is to try and organise our thinking about what we're doing when we run A/B tests in CRO, specifically around the idea of trying to describe something about what's going on in the mind of a user that we might be able to intervene on through changes we could make to a site, or indeed in other points of contact with the customer. The core idea is that you can interpret and reinterpret the independent variable of an experiment in A/B testing. There is a very literal description of what it is that you tested, which could be just a description of the components involved. You know, we added element X with copy Y, and it was on this page, on this website, and so on. But we don't really want to limit our learning to just that. It doesn't really tell you much about what you ought to do next or about what other users might do in other contexts. It's about trying to give ourselves a vocabulary and a set of concepts to describe what over and above what we literally tested in an experiment, what the implementation was, can we describe to then build up evidence to learn in a broader way, to learn what might work on other pages of that site, what other tactics might be effective, and even to scale up to the level of what is it that's going on in the mind of a user that can be successfully intervened on better in one industry than another through one or other means, and even in across our sample as CRO generally. So it's that extra layer of interpretation on top that we're trying to use to build better frameworks for learning.
So this lever framework has been formulated around 16 years worth of iterations. Am I correct in that? It's not something that's just popped out and said, oh, well, this is the next shiniest thing.
No, so the concept of a lever has been around for a long time. I mean, longer than a decade, I believe. I think it was the invention, or at least coined in an important way, by Stephen Pavlovich. Who was for a long time the CEO of Conversion, now I think a director of the wider Sideshow group to which we belong. And that was aimed at describing exactly this kind of thing, and it was a key part of the strategies already. So people were working on their own client programs, they were coming up with their own set of concepts to describe what was important to users for them, and using that to guide them on how they should iterate. So what seems to be working well, what can we learn from, what should we do more of or less of. Where the levers framework came in, and I think the work on this more formal framework started around 3 years or so ago, was to say, well, can we canonize these concepts? A fairly brief look at the meta-analysis data as it was at that stage would show you that because people had been a bit siloed in their thinking, they all had their own set of lever concepts, they really weren't mapping together in a nice way to actually aggregate data from across individual programs. So people were using different words for the same things. They were using one really broadly scoped concept in one context, like, you know, all of UX or usability, and someone else might be talking much more about the specifics of user flow and so on. So the idea was that if we could get one common currency, a common language, common system of concepts, we would, across different programs, across months and years and different practitioners, all be able to develop consistent data which could be collated together, so we could learn more in the long term. That is, I think, the shift that the levers framework was bringing in over and above the levers system which was already in place.
So your particular levers framework has what I would describe as master levers and sub-levers and levers, which all sounds very complex in its instance, because obviously if we talk about the master levers first, which are, I believe, five different elements, and then while we talk through each one of those, we might touch into one of the normal levers and then a sub-lever. But can you just go through what the five are first of all?
Sure. So at the top level, so this is going to, well, across these five categories, going to describe the whole space of experiments that we're interested in. Every experiment is going to belong to one of these top five categories, being cost, trust, usability, comprehension and motivation. So cost being, what's the downside of what's required in order to benefit from the product and what they're agreeing to in the transaction. Trust, we'll get into a bit more, but broadly being about how trustworthy the brand or site is. Usability, your ability to move through the set of actions that's needed in order for you to fulfill your goal on a site. Comprehension, how well you understand the product or services on offer, and motivation, the inverse of cost. What's the upside of this product or service? And as you say, because each of those is breaking out into subcategories, there are a lot of distinctions that will sit within them, a lot of ways to reinterpret what you're changing in an experiment, 3 possible levels at which you could describe it. Different levels of specificity, but basically you already have full coverage at the top level of those 5 categories. It's just they're each a very broad set. Lots of different varied experiments might sit underneath trust or usability.
Yeah, so let's just go into cost as the first one there. Reading the white paper, it's saying that costs that a user encounters while completing a purchase or using a product, these can be monetary, effort related, or otherwise. But how can you define what that real cost is, or how do you presume what that real cost is?
So when we're classifying, it's the independent variable of an experiment. So this is one of the key use cases. How is it that we classify what's an experiment concerned with cost? We aren't able to directly measure it, what it is we're changing in a lot of cases, unless we're actually changing the monetary price itself. We're using kind of definitions and examples. For experiments related to cost, we're talking about experiments that are mitigating the perception of cost critically. So how is it that a user perceives the cost rather than how it is it might actually negatively impact them in the end? We're interested in what's going to impact their decision of whether or not to commit to whatever the conversion is that you're interested in, rather than how it might play out in the end. And yeah, that I think is the core of the definition. But it's also... Sorry, go on.
Sorry. No, you carry on.
I was just going to distinguish a little bit within that. It's the perception of cost, but there is a financial cost side to it, which is, it could be the actual price changing or framing effects, looking at breaking out cost per day to reduce the intuitive sense of how costly it is, contrasting between 2 options where one seems cheaper by comparison, and on the other side, the soft costs. So a user's perception of, rather than the money they'll have to give up in exchange to benefit from a product, the level of time and effort that might be required. So that will be important for products like education and news subscriptions, even something like Headspace, for example. So there's a degree of input you're going to need that isn't monetary, that is potentially a cost to the user that we might want to mitigate how they perceive it.
And presumably you talk about cost differently when you talk about financial, say banking, insurance and things like that, because there's also the cost of not doing it as well as the cost of doing it and the time that it takes.
Yes, so this would sit on the motivation side. What's the upside of the product? What is it that you would be missing out on? What we're interested in when we talk about cost experiments is how do we mitigate the sense of perceived cost associated with the conversion. And as you say, one way to do that might be to emphasize the cost of not doing it. But we would see that as an upside of the product, something in favor of conversion that we wouldn't be seeking to mitigate, but to emphasize.
So the second lever is trust. And I think from my own perspective and from being in this industry for quite some time, I would say that's probably has become one of the big aspects of being online is, do people trust who they're communicating with? Is the website legitimate? Is the information that they're passing through going to be used spuriously and spamming, etc., etc.? And are they actually going to get the goods or services that they want to that they're trying to purchase? Just as a adjunct, pulling out of the levers for one moment, are the levers set up in order of importance? And if so, how would they be measured as important or not?
So the short answer would be no. And in some ways, I would hesitate to say that any one lever, particularly any one master lever, is more important than another in a generic sense or in the sense of importance to the user. But I do think the idea is very interesting, and any lever could, at its extreme, be pivotally important to a user. A user is very likely not going to purchase if they think the product is prohibitively expensive. But also, if they think the website is a scam, they're very unlikely to convert. If they simply can't find a path to conversion, they don't know what the product is or does or why it would benefit them. So at the extremes there is a way that any one of these master levers could be failed such that a user simply won't convert. But we do have some empirical data comparing the different categories in terms of more how effective they are. So as it happens, actually, all 5 master levers perform fairly similarly in terms of their probability of winning within a few percentage points of one another. That's before you segment by the industry, where we see more interesting differences and often more practical differences that are going to impact how you prioritize your program early on. But we do see a bigger difference in the average impact of experiments, where comprehension, for example, has a relatively substantial lead over both cost and trust. But one thing that is worth emphasizing about this kind of meta-analysis is that there is a disconnect between what aggregate experiment outcome data can tell you and importance to the user per se. Because in practice, what this meta-analysis is indicating is something about the expected impact of a change of an independent variable in an experiment. How impactful is that experiment likely to be based on historic data, rather than the importance to the user per se. It could, for example, be a reflection of comprehension suffering from a greater deficit across a lot of websites. So as it happens in our sample, or maybe more broadly, comprehension is just a problem that websites have struggled with. And anecdotally, I would say that comprehension is somewhere that people in charge of a site can sometimes struggle to intuitively understand what a user might think. They just know the product and site too well, and this impacts how they interpret and write copy describing a product and how they emphasize different messages. So when we come in as an external agency, maybe with a fresh view of that and a bit of wider context, we might have a particular advantage there. And one thing I would add to this as well is sometimes a category can just be more actionable than others. I remember doing some work trying to find some good trust and particular social proof assurances on a subscription site that had some websites across Europe, and all the research across the different markets was pointing to credibility being a real problem. And we had a real substantial winner deploying Trustpilot on the homepage, nothing new or imaginative, something I imagine most of the CRO will be familiar with, if not have done. But it was a huge thing because Trustpilot is a widely recognized, often common currency for trustworthiness. But we simply couldn't replicate that in the other markets. There wasn't the same common point of reference that could be used, even though the research data suggested it was just as much of a problem. So all this is to say that while we can learn a little bit from this kind of large-scale analysis about what's likely to be effective, this also reflects how big problems are in the first place when you start running experiments, along with how actionable things actually are, which kind of gives a bit of a disconnect between, with telling you what's important to a user. And of course, I would advise, generally to anyone listening to this, you really want to find out what's needed and most effective in your specific site context, rather than relying just on what works generically and in particular on best practice.
Yeah, because I was thinking from a trust perspective, there must be certain different levels of trust from the user based upon the value of the purchase. I'm sure a £5,000 purchase is expecting a lot more trust than maybe a £20 purchase.
I would suspect so, yeah. I think transaction value isn't something which is precisely reflected in our data set. Maybe that's a shortcoming and something that we should look at. I'd be interested to look at detailed data on that. We do know that's relevant to this question. Trust does tend to be a really important master lever for industries that have a high level of commitment or complexity, like insurance, for example. Trust is at least marginally the most impactful lever there in terms of win rate, at least. And in a B2B context, it does seem to have an advantage over B2C segmented like that, which could be related to increased costs, albeit they're not necessarily incurred by the purchaser in the same way. But in my experience, at least, I would say, yeah, when the commitment is larger, for example, when you have larger or more expensive subscriptions as well, that's somewhere where trust is more likely to be more critical. And I guess anecdotally, you would say, well, there are brands which survive on selling ultra cheap products, despite probably having questionable levels of overall trust in the market, and you have to suspect they wouldn't be sustainable if it weren't for some level of compromise there. And you would imagine that a lot of prestige brands simply couldn't manage to sustain themselves like that. So I think it's a very good hypothesis, but one which, unfortunately, I don't think we have currently the variables to answer directly, but I think it'd be one to look into.
Yeah, there's a couple of phrases that come to mind. Let the buyer beware, and the other one is too good to be true. And I think that they're kind of melded into behaviour of people say, well, that's a good price. And when they get to price comparison, in other words, they found out what product they want to buy and now they're looking for the cheapest price overall, they tend to, I would say, put trust lower down the scale than price. And I was just about to ask the question, is it important to every user, and does price often trump the trust element?
It's interesting. I mean, this comes back a bit to the point about how critical each lever can be at the extremes, I suppose. I mean, ultimately, people don't want to give their payment details and personal information to an illegitimate company or to be scammed, kind of price aside. So a question of legitimacy, this specific extreme problem of trust, which is, a mid-level lever that sits underneath as a subcategory of trust. We're talking about, are you a legitimate company? Are you a scam? I suspect that might be harder to trump with cost. But if we think about credibility, so that's the extent to which you're seen as overall a reliable and competent service and product, and how plausible your motivational claims are, that might be something which can be more discounted against the price. Ultimately, both of them are being leveraged to mitigate risk perceptions to some extent. So to what extent do I want to discount the claims that they're making about their product versus what is the actual financial discount that I'm receiving on the cost side? So I suspect there might be a little bit more of a trade-off there when you are dealing with a less extreme version of trust problems.
So how would you measure a user's propensity to provide personal details? Because obviously it varies with regard to what product or service you're selling. But is there a surefire way of being able to ensure that you're creating the smoothest path to people providing details? And then we get to that whole kind of filling in a form, how many form fields do you need, etc., etc. That surely must impact trust as well.
Yeah. So there is information that is sensitive to users. People can be reluctant to provide their payment information, to provide personal information about themselves, or information that they might think is invasive, even if broadly they have a reasonable degree of trust in that brand. They at least don't think they're giving it to an illegitimate company, but still they might be hesitant. Broadly, I guess the two questions are: can we justify this request? Or can we remove this request? So can we adequately explain to the user why it is we're asking for it and how it won't be misused? Or, in fact, could we live without that information entirely? Can we run an experiment to find out, well, what would the conversion rate impact of removing that entirely be? And does this payoff what might be required from us in the back end to no longer use it? For example, if that information is used for marketing outreach, is there a cost-benefit analysis which can be informed there? But as for how you could I guess determine how much of a problem there actually is. I think it comes back to the kinds of research methods you'd be using aside from the levers framework, really. So you might be looking at surveys which indicate the scale of this problem. So are users often saying that they're leaving the website because of this particular problem? User sessions might bring up some responses relevant to it, albeit with a smaller, less representative sample. You could even look at an analytics. Are there particular sensitive looking fields that people are dropping off at or trying not to complete? So trying to understand, are users completing these fields and how do they feel about it? And if users are either failing to complete them or feel negatively about them in a way that's ultimately leading them to drop off, what solutions are available to us? Are we able to address their concern, or do we have to seriously consider removing the field entirely if that's an option?
Well, I think we covered trust quite comprehensively there, which is great. Other things that you've got is usability. Now, presumably usability is measured by using the existing website to determine roadblocks, etc., and things like that. What other areas do you use to determine that usability?
Yeah, so it is all about this process by which a user is going to move through a website. Although actually the intention is that these concepts could be applied elsewhere at other touch points, but in a simple website case, we're asking questions like, does the user know where they are? So what site and what step they're currently on, and what they need to do next in order to progress. So is everything signposted? Are they aware where they are in the wider journey and what they might need to do? Is there a lot of effort or exertion being asked of users to progress in order to complete whatever it is their goal is, or even do they anticipate that something is going to be a lot of effort? So, sometimes it's about actually removing friction, removing the amount of effort it takes. Sometimes before a form that people expect might be really long, it can be just about that anticipated effort. Are people dropping off even before they start it because it's too intimidating a prospect? And then things like, are you organising your products and options in a way which makes it easy to compare and find the most relevant ones? Are you relying on users to retain a lot of information between different products and try and compute that in their head when actually you can make that easier for them? And, are you directing their attention towards the right things overall? Are there distractions on the site? So these are the kinds of questions that are making up that fairly broad concept of usability, ultimately about how it is that a user can get through a site to achieve their goal.
Because usability is probably one of the easiest things to fix, I would say, because you can do A/B testing and you can see hopefully where those roadblocks are going to be. And probably it's also part of, I would say, the lever before trust and the lever after the comprehension and things like that. Because if you get that usability correct, then obviously you're improving the flow, and it means that the comprehension that you're trying to deliver, which is the next lever, is likely to be of a better quality. And you mentioned earlier, as we move on towards comprehension, that those people who write websites, if they're technically orientated, they may write content very technical. And so the audience that they're trying to engage with may not be quite so technical. Is it challenging to make sure there's a good blend of both technical and what I would describe as layman's terms?
I mean, it's all about the site context and understanding the audiences involved. I would say, and this is again probably more on the anecdotal side, often the problem is too rich and detailed an understanding, assuming too many concepts already make sense in the mind of the user. But there are also cases where that I've seen where the value proposition is pitched in a way which is seen as too rudimentary for some of the more technical power users, particularly if you're dealing with something which is related to higher end software as a service, web hosting and things. So I'd say it's difficult to say generically. It really is about going through that process of understanding your audiences and what terminology do they think in terms of what is it that they're actually looking for, what's their mental model like, and how do we match ourselves up to that.
So one of the things I see very rarely is actually asking the user in their experience what type of user they are, whether they're technical, whether they have some understanding or they have no understanding whatsoever. But it's not used that often. I'm not seeing, if you go onto a website, could you tell me whether you've purchased something like this before or whether you've used a service like this before? Because some of those websites are hugely complex, and I know they're probably aimed at people which have got a far bigger brain than I have. But it's definitely one of those things where I think you can lose people through the journey because you're assuming too much. And by having that choice selection, in the first couple of pages, to be able to say, let's push you into a particular area where you feel comfortable in the technology and we can actually talk to you in your terms of which you're expecting, rather than being too highfalutin or too basic.
Yeah, no, I think that's it's a really interesting idea. I think there's probably often a concern with not disrupting user journeys at all and trying to have one really streamlined journey that works for everyone. But there are cases that I've seen where they just have a very varied or kind of clustered audience. There is one set of users who are looking for very advanced information and another kind of hobbyist set, for example, who are coexisting with them on the site, who just don't have that level of understanding. It's something that I've actually proposed a similar experiment to before, not for a program that we were actually running, so unfortunately didn't get to see whether that was run. But I do think it's an interesting idea and approach.
I think the final one that we've got here is motivation, and I would say that's probably the most complex area of any of these levers, is that there's so much to do with it, whether it's comfort with something, whether excitement with something, whether it's joy with something, and being able to understand how that person feels along that way. It's very emotive, and it means to me to be able to have a lot of empathy with the user, which is blooming difficult to measure, I would think.
Yeah, and because there are so many different kinds of consideration here, you can see even at a quick glance at the levers framework that there are many more distinctions included under motivation than are included under any of the other categories, and it can be unwieldy in that way. And I think it comes back to something we mentioned right at the start, which is that difficulty managing explanations at the level of a population rather than an individual. The users are very varied, and there's no one factor that's ever going to comprehensively explain why each user, let alone all of these users, convert or not, regardless of what lever you're discussing. But I think there may be more variability on motivation, and to some extent this is always the case when you're explaining decisions at scale, whether you're using the levers framework or any other way of describing mindsets and behavior. I mean, talking about thousands, even millions of users, some of them might not convert because they drop their phone in a puddle. There's so much going on there, but our job is to develop theories and variables which explain enough about user populations on aggregate to influence behavior in a meaningful and measurable way. With that said, I think motivation is a space where I end up having more descriptions of the independent variables, of the considerations of the user and their interests that sit at a slightly more granular level than the sub-levers of the levers framework go. If you take a category like benefits, for example, you might be interested in which specific benefits are most effective, but you've kind of already reached the highest level of granularity in the framework. Mm-hmm. You might run a series of experiments looking to understand, which of these features do we emphasize? And this is something we've talked about at Conversion as we continue to iterate and evolve this levers framework. Is there an effective way to describe these distinctions in a meaningful way that isn't just bound to a specific site and its offerings? Are there categories which describe parts of a value proposition that you could generalize across industries? And to some extent, there is already some of this represented. If you look at categories like altruism and sociability, these are telling you something relatively specific about the offering, but something which is still going to be general across a lot of different sites and even industries. So the question then becomes, well, are there more underlying values we could use as a vocabulary to do this as a way in? Are we selling peace of mind, convenience, or aspiration, for example? These might be the kinds of promising categories which can be used to try and understand all of these ways that particular messages might resonate with the user, or the many and varied kinds of upside that users might perceive to different degrees. And as for measurement itself, again, the framework is kind of agnostic about it. It is a conceptual framework to help you set up concepts to learn through, but it's not itself going to give you any data. You have to feed data into it and see over time on aggregate which ones work better than others across multiple executions. So could it be that appealing to altruism or sociability or whatever else it is working better on aggregate overall? But as a personal preference, I think something like surveys, on-site surveys, might be valuable for this, where you want a more sensitive ranking. Mm-hmm. So you don't just want a handful of users to say, oh, I like this or I like this. You're trying to see at scale, how do they rank against each other, and how might that help us prioritize which ones to appeal to. You might also try and think about, well, if there's lots of possible ways to position this and lots of ways we might prioritize them or order this messaging, how do we set up an efficient sequence of experiments? So how is it that we could keep introducing a new benefit or reordering the benefits and try to do it in a lighter way, because there's just so much space that you need to cover. So it's a tricky subject, not one that I think is distinct to a levers IV of experimentation, but one that that I think levers can already help you get some way towards doing, just by giving you good buckets for your data, good concepts that you can use to try and learn over time, whether it's through surveys, experiments, or whatever else. But I think it could be somewhere that more work could be done to actually enrich that vocabulary further.
Because one of the things I think is motivation is different to different people at different times in the day, and what's going on in their life anyway. They could be really excited. They could have been doing something really good, and it's 11 o'clock at night. They've had a few beers, and they're on the site, and they've got plenty of excitement and motivation and things like that. And it could be that the next day they come on the same site, and they've probably lost at the football match or whatever. And so there's different kinds of things. But one of the things I noticed that there wasn't in that specifically, and it may be just it blurs into it, is time of day in motivation. And is time of day one of those things that alters people's motivation or not, do you think?
Yeah, I think you've outlined a very plausible case there where it might do. I think we would see time of day as more of an audience feature than a lever per se, in that it's not something we can necessarily intervene. I mean, we can't change the time of day, one thing. We would probably be more likely to fit it into that position in our wider framework. So we would say, well, we have this kind of audience, which is an audience of users who are on our site at this time of day. What are the optimal levers in order to present to that audience at that time? Having said that, this isn't something I've directly studied, but I think it's another very interesting possible line of inquiry. If you were to find out, imagine if you had dynamic comprehension content that in different time zones, different times of day, could be showing simpler or more complex things based on, if someone's reading in the morning, maybe they're going to be more able to read through something maybe outside of work hours versus within work hours, and so on and so on. Maybe something very dynamic could be effective there. But as I say, it's not something I've studied, though it does sound interesting.
It could be, it could expand this to being, say, okay, if it's 9 o'clock at night and you're in the UK and use geolocation, pinpoint their fact in a pub, that kind of be mind-blowing with regard to what you could do at that point in time with regard to stimulating somebody in a different way. Yeah. Obviously a bit futuristic, but I'm sure it's on the horizon of some person's agenda somewhere along the line.
Yes, I mean, there's lots of very advanced and automated personalisation out there, and I think when you are getting into the world of how do we account for real one-to-one personalisation, these real minutiae of each individual's decision, it's not something which is practical to make sense of for running A/B tests at a standard cadence. It almost steps outside of the realm of, well, we're actually going to understand it. We're not going to understand why everyone does everything they do, but instead you put it into the hands of massive automated data processing, which is simply going to be entirely predictive, not necessarily giving you things that you can learn from, generate claims from, try and plan your own experiments from, but is almost going to take care of it itself to try and pinpoint those correlations in what works at different times. And I think some automated mass scale A/B testing behind that kind of thing could be the way that you're ultimately going to calibrate to that, rather than this more manual approach which most programs will be taking at this stage.
Ollie, got a couple more questions to go, but it seems that the lever framework is very, very comprehensive, and I know that you could go into the minutiae of each one of these particular elements in your white paper with regard to it. But do you think it's potentially out of the reach for small to medium-sized organisations to get their head round? Is the framework a framework that has to be adhered to, or is it a dip in and dip out of?
So to pick up on the point first, I guess, of how you might reasonably start out as a small to medium-sized company, there's obviously a very practical side to using the levers framework, which is you need to be using it for your data collection, and the more data you're able to collect, the more value you're going to get out of it. But this can start with something really simple, like just having a Google Sheet with a list of experiment names, outcomes, and levers describing the experiment's independent variable. And then fairly quickly, you're going to start finding out things that you might not have seen before. And we've seen this as we recategorize historic experimentation programs under their own bespoke levers onto the levers framework, found missed opportunities, underexploited levers that were sitting in there, but we simply didn't have the vocabulary and the system of concepts to actually discover that they were there. We simply weren't looking at them through that lens. As for exactly how extremely to commit to it, I mean, if we have to be realistic, we may not think that every part of a program is going to be adjusted. So maybe you start tagging up for meta-analysis, but you're not necessarily willing to tag every level of insight and carry that all the way through. You might not be willing to actually plan for lever validity, for example. So that's the idea that, to have as clean a data set as possible for this kind of analysis of multiple experiments, you ideally don't want to be mixing up levers too much. So you want your experiment that's under user flow to avoid any changes which could be intervening through another route. Now, the hope is that this should start to cancel out as you aggregate up and you pick out more and more of the signal of what a particular lever is doing outside of the noise of the other disparate influences it might have. But a lot of the time you might be working with a smaller sample, and that's a very practical and likely thing if you are a smaller or medium-sized company. I would say the more you commit to it, the more value you're likely to get out of it, but it's far from out of reach. For those easy steps of just tagging up your experiments first, seeing what kinds of things you might learn from that, if it shows that it's valuable, then consider tagging up your problem statements, your insights, and guiding your way through ideation as well. So narrowing down from, okay, well, I have a usability problem. What kind of usability problem do I have, or what kind of trust problem do I have, to narrow down the space of solutions can actually end up being a really efficient thing to do. I start from 5 categories that are describing the whole space, and then by choosing one of them, I've already ruled out most of the levers, most of the comprehensiveness and complexity, and I've found an efficient way to a smaller set of solutions. So I think it can be a very useful thing for dealing with the difficulties and complexity of experimentation, for as much as it looks like it's just such a big framework with so many categories going on. You rule most of them out relatively quickly.
I'm not knocking it. I think it's an absolutely brilliant piece of work here, because I think lots of those things aren't thought about at the levels of which you've described them in this framework. So it is a great framework to be able to use your thinking and your actions based upon those thinking, which is absolutely fantastic. One of the questions, and I think the answer is probably yes, it does, but presumably this framework works for both B2B and B2C brands.
Yeah, so far we've not had any problems applying it in B2B context. In fact, we've seen some of our bigger ROI successes in categorizing and, as I say, recategorizing pre-lever framework concepts under levers in this context. In some ways, that's the benefit of the comprehensiveness of the framework. We're looking to cover a large space of relevant possible considerations without necessarily prejudging too much whether each one's going to be important. So even if you were thinking in terms of B2C, when you're putting these categories together, though we did have a slightly more holistic approach than that, you would end up seeing things that are likely to be relevant in B2B. In fact, it was designed to account for all of this, and so far we see that it does relatively well. So there's an upside to that comprehensiveness as well, which is applying to lots of use cases. So yeah, I would encourage anyone, regardless of what industry they are, whether B2B, B2C, so on, to seriously consider seeing whether they can get value out of this as a way of starting to conduct meta-analysis, but also a way to start organizing your thinking, to start narrowing down solutions, and all the areas of the process where it can step in. And I think we'll be sharing more information about that. At Conversion, we've presented some more practical details on the step-by-step of how that might work that we'll be sharing soon.
Ed, it's been a fascinating discussion. I think we could probably spend a couple of hours going through this, because there is so many interesting points that we've only really touched at the master levels and perhaps dabbled in a couple of the levels. But it's one of those things I'm sure you'll get lots of interest in it beyond this. But for now, Ed, thank you so much. It's been really great, and I'm sure we'll speak again.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure, and some fantastic questions and interesting conversation indeed. So thank you.